Hi, my name is Emily, a curator here at the John Heinz History Center. Welcome to 1968, the year that rocked America. 1968 was the most tumultuous year in a very turbulent decade. We're going to do a chronological walkthrough of the year 1968, learning month by month the major events that happened through the course of the year. We enter a typical 1968 living room where we learn about the living room war. So the Tet Offensive happens in January 1968, and it was during a typical ceasefire of the war. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attack American-held cities in South Vietnam, and this is shown on television. Americans sitting in their living room see the Vietnamese storm the American embassy, and it's a major turning point in people's opinions about the war. They turn against the war. We have the living room war represented by a Huey helicopter that has landed in this typical American living room.
Say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory.
After the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite, known as the most trusted man in America, went to Vietnam himself to see what was going on. He declared that we were mired in stalemate. When Johnson heard what Walter Cronkite had said, he knew that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. February 11th through the 18th proved to be the deadliest week in the Vietnam War for American soldiers, with over 500 servicemen killed in that week. So in 1968, a record number of baby boomers flood college campuses. And here we have a typical 1968 dorm room. And in the storm room, we see anti-war posters. And if we look in her drawer, we can see her oral contraceptives and her love beads, her roach clip. All these things kind of symbolize the generation gap that was talked about so much in 1968. Many college students rallied around the anti-war campaign of Senator Eugene McCarthy. McCarthy went on to almost win the New Hampshire primary in 1968, in part due to the Get Clean for Gene campaign, where college students shaved their beards, cut their hair so they could campaign door to door for Eugene McCarthy. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there to support the sanitation workers' strike. And here we have artifacts from his memorial service held at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Before he was assassinated, he was the co-pastor at Ebenezer with his father. After Martin Luther was assassinated, riots erupted across America, including here in Pittsburgh. Before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King had been gearing up for a major march on Washington. Their campaign was called the Poor People's Campaign, and they carried on with it even after his assassination. The Poor People's Campaign was seen as a failure because it didn't change any major laws in Washington, but it did serve to bring many of the poor of America together and many of the activists for these various groups that hadn't had much contact before. So it was leaders in the African American community, the Mexican American, the Native American, and in poor Appalachian communities that came together and worked together from this point on. After Martin Luther King was assassinated, Ralph Abernathy became the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he led the Poor People's Campaign and the march, and these are the boots he wore during the Poor People's Campaign. In June of 1968, the nation was shocked by violence again after Robert Kennedy was assassinated shortly after winning the Democratic primary of California. This is the camera used by William Epperidge, who was the reporter that was assigned to the Kennedy campaign. He used this camera to take this famous shot of Kennedy on the kitchen floor of the Ambassador Hotel. February of 1968, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood went national. This Pittsburgh-based show became the longest-running children's show in television history. Here we have the original Mr. Rogers set seen for the first time outside of the WQED studios. In the spring of 1968, the Sears Roebuck Foundation, which funded the show, said that in a time of violence, Mr. Rogers spoke calmly about how to cope with violence. Here we have some of the puppets from the neighborhood of make-believe, including Henrietta Pussycat, who was voiced by Mr. Rogers, and we also have the castle of King Friday. In July, the exhibit talks about what Nixon terms the silent center of Americans, who were not active in civil rights or anti-war movements, but in fact reacted against what they saw as the lawlessness in American society. And appealing to that feeling was third-party candidate George Wallace, who ran a law and order and segregationist campaign. Former governor of Alabama, George Wallace, ran for president in 1968 as the third-party candidate. He appealed to the fears of Southern whites and eventually won 5 states in the Deep South. For every exhibit that we do here, we like to have a local connection. And here we have a timeline of Pittsburgh events in 1968. This shows that what was going on in Pittsburgh was connected to what was going on in the rest of the country. For months leading up to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, there were rumors of major protests being planned to protest the war in Vietnam. The Chicago police, already tense from rioting earlier in the year after MLK's assassination, preparing for a major battle with protesters. As anti-war demonstrators begin to form a crowd in front of the Hilton Hotel where the convention is being held, inside the convention, the anti-war platform is defeated. The crowd begins to chant, "The whole world is watching," as the police start to break up the demonstration by beating the protesters in front of television cameras who record the whole 17 minutes of rioting, which is later termed a police riot by a national study. So September focuses on women. So by 1968, women are making up 40% of the workforce, but receiving on average 60% less pay than men. Women were also involved in many of the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s, but increasingly felt marginalized in those movements. September of 1968 marks the first major national coverage of the growing women's liberation movement, as it was called in the late 60s. So a group of women formed outside the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City to protest the pageant. They had a freedom trash can that they filled with objects of female torture, such as curlers and Playboy magazines, bras, and things of that nature. October, we learn about radical movements for power and inclusion, including the Brown Berets, the Black Panthers, and the American Indian movement that was started in 1968 in Minneapolis. The most potent symbol for these movements were the Black Power fist raised in defiance at the Olympics by Tommie Smith and John Carlos, who won the 200 meter. Here we have the Olympic torch from the 1968 Olympics. This was the torch that was carried into the stadium, and it was the first to be carried by a woman on the last leg of its run. The American Indian movement starts in Minneapolis in 1968, but it got its major coverage in 1969 with the takeover of Alcatraz Island, where one of the members wore this vest. So by 1968, Martin Luther King's nonviolent stance was losing popularity, and the more militant stance of groups like the Black Panthers and leaders such as Stokely Carmichael and Huey Newton were gaining popularity within the African American community as frustrations built over increasing and continual inequality in those communities. So 1968, the election of 1968 was known as the realignment election. From the era of New Deal liberalism and Franklin Roosevelt up to 1968, Democrats have won 7 out of 9 presidential nominations. After 1968, up till 2008, Republicans won 7 out of 10 of the presidential elections. And of course, in 1968, Nixon wins the election by a vast majority of the electoral vote, but a small majority of the popular vote. So with this interactive, you have a chance to rewrite history. First, you come over here and learn about each of the candidates for president in 1968. When you click the link, you can even watch videos from their campaigns. Then you enter the booth Pick your candidate. Pull the lever.
Evidence attention to escalated to intensify the war.
So in December, we enter the same living room that we left in January. After a year of chaos, we end on a hopeful note with the Apollo 8 mission. Here we have the Apollo 8 command module that has landed in that same living room, and we watch on television as Walter Cronkite records the most watched television event in history to date, which was the Apollo 8 mission where man first orbited the moon. Artifacts from the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. This is the bubble helmet, the watch, and the mission checklist from the Apollo 8 mission. There are 3 pop culture lounges spread throughout the exhibit. Here in the TV and movie lounge, we learn about the popular and groundbreaking movies and television shows of 1968, from Laugh-In to 60 Minutes and The Graduate to Night of the Living Dead.
Now you must let me do my job, no matter who dies.
Now we're in the music lounge where you can learn about the popular music of 1968 through both the music trip quiz, and you can flip through the album covers that were popular in 1968. It wasn't all about the Beatles and Janis Joplin, but we also learned that Elvis Presley had his comeback in 1968. Johnny Cash recorded Folsom Prison Blues. Aretha Franklin had many #1 hits, as well as Tammy Wynette and Dolly Parton. Janis Joplin's concert outfits, complete with her feather boa from the Experience Music Project in Seattle. So here you have a chance to make your own album cover using imagery from many of the albums from 1968. Pick your background. Capture your image. Decorate it. Here in the consumer lounge, we learn about the popular products, materials, and patterns from 1968, from plastics to cash vehicles.